Chapter 23. Mistress Affery makes a conditional promise respecting her dreams. Left alone with the expressive looks and gestures of Mr. Baptiste, otherwise Giovanni Battista Cavaletto, vividly before him, Clennam entered on a weary day. It was in vain that he tried to control his attention by directing it to any business occupation or train of thought. It rode at anchor by the haunting topic, and would hold to no other idea. As though a criminal should be chained in a stationary boat on a deep, clear river, condemned, whatever countless leagues of water flowed past him, always to see the body of the fellow creature he had drowned lying at the bottom, immovable and unchangeable, except as the eddies made it broad or long, now expanding, now contracting its terrible lineaments. So Arthur, below the shifting current of transparent thoughts and fancies, which were gone and succeeded by others as soon as come, saw, steady and dark, and not to be stirred from its place, the one subject that he endeavoured with all his might to rid himself of, and that he could not fly from. The assurance he now had that Blondois, whatever his right name, was one of the worst of characters, greatly augmented the burden of his anxieties. Though the disappearance should be accounted for tomorrow, the fact that his mother had been in communication with such a man would remain unalterable. That the communication had been of a secret kind, and that she had been submissive to him and afraid of him, he hoped might be known to no one beyond himself. Yet, knowing it, how could he separate it from his old vague fears, and how believe that there was nothing evil in such relations? Her resolution not to enter on the question with him, and his knowledge of her indomitable character, enhanced his sense of helplessness. It was like the oppression of a dream to believe that shame and exposure were impending over her and his father's memory, and to be shut out, as by a brazen wall, from the possibility of coming to their aid. The purpose he had brought home to his native country, and had ever since kept in view, was, with her greatest determination, defeated by his mother herself, at the time of all others when he feared that it pressed most. His advice, energy, activity, money, credit, all his resources whatsoever, were all made useless. If she had been possessed of the old fabled influence, and had turned those who looked upon her into stone, she could not have rendered him more completely powerless, so it seemed to him in his distress of mind, than she did, when she turned her unyielding face to his in her gloomy room. But the light of that day's discovery, shining on these considerations, roused him to take a more decided course of action. Confident in the rectitude of his purpose, and impelled by a sense of overhanging danger closing in around, he resolved, if his mother would still admit of no approach, to make a desperate appeal to Affery. If she could be brought to become communicative, and to do what lay in her to break the spell of secrecy that enshrouded the house, he might shake off the paralysis of which every hour that passed over his head made him more acutely sensible. This was the result of his day's anxiety, and this was the decision he put in practice when the day closed in. His first disappointment, on arriving at the house, was to find the door open, and Mr. Flintwich smoking a pipe on the steps. If circumstances had been commonly favourable, Mistress Affery would have opened the door to his knock. Circumstances being uncommonly unfavourable, the door stood open, and Mr. Flintwich was smoking his pipe on the steps. "Good evening," said Arthur. "Good evening," said Mr. Flintwich. The smoke came crookedly out of Mr. Flintwich's mouth, as if it circulated through the whole of his wry figure and came back by his wry throat, before coming forth to mingle with the smoke from the crooked chimneys and the mists from the crooked river. "Have you any news?" said Arthur. "We have no news," said Jeremiah. "I mean of the foreign man," Arthur explained. "I mean of the foreign man," said Jeremiah. He looked so grim as he stood askew, with the knot of his cravat under his ear, that the thought passed into Clennam's mind, and not for the first time by many, could Flintwich, for a purpose of his own, have got rid of Blondois? Could it have been his secret and his safety that they were at issue? He was small and bent, and perhaps not actively strong, yet he was as tough as an old yew tree, and as crusty as an old jackdaw. Such a man, coming behind a much younger and more vigorous man, and having the will to put an end to him and no relenting, might do it pretty surely in that solitary place at a late hour. While in the morbid condition of his thoughts, these thoughts drifted over the main one that was always in Clennam's mind. Mr. Flintwich, regarding the opposite house over the gateway with his neck twisted and one eye shut up, stood smoking with a vicious expression upon him, more as if he were trying to bite off the stem of his pipe than as if he were enjoying it. Yet he was enjoying it in his own way. "You'll be able to take my likeness the next time you call, Arthur, I should think," said Mr. Flintwich, dryly, as he stooped to knock the ashes out. Rather conscious and confused, Arthur asked his pardon if he had stared at him unpolitely. "But my mind runs so much upon this matter," he said, "that I lose myself." "Ah, yet I don't see," returned Mr. Flintwich, quite at his leisure, "why it should trouble you, Arthur." "No? No," said Mr. Flintwich, very shortly and decidedly, much as if he were the canine race, and snapped at Arthur's hand. "Is it nothing to see those placards about? Is it nothing to me to see my mother's name and residence hawked up and down in such an association?" "I don't see," returned Mr. Flintwich, scraping his horny cheek, "that it need signify much to you. But I'll tell you what I do see, Arthur," glancing up at the windows. "I see the light of fire and candle in your mother's room." "And what has that to do with it?" "Why, sir, I read by it," said Mr. Flintwich, screwing himself at him, "that if it's advisable, as the proverb says it is, to let sleeping dogs lie, it's just as advisable, perhaps, to let missing dogs lie. Let 'em be. They generally turn up soon enough." Mr. Flintwich turned short round when he had made this remark, and went into the dark hall. Clennam stood there, following him with his eyes as he dipped for a light in the phosphorus box in the little room at the side, got one after 3 or 4 dips, and lighted the dim lamp against the wall. All the while Clennam was pursuing the probabilities, rather as if they were being shown to him by an invisible hand than as if he himself were conjuring them up, of Mr. Flintwich's ways and means of doing that darker deed and removing its traces by any of the black avenues of shadow that lay around them. "Now, sir," said the testy Jeremiah, "will it be agreeable to walk upstairs?" "My mother is alone, I suppose?" "Not alone," said Mr. Flintwich. "Mr. Casby and his daughter are with her. They came in while I was smoking, and I stayed behind to have my smoke out." This was the second disappointment. Arthur made no remark upon it, and repaired to his mother's room, where Mr. Casby and Flora had been taking tea, anchovy paste, and hot buttered toast. The relics of those delicacies were not yet removed, either from the table or from the scorched countenance of Affery, who, with the kitchen toasting fork still in her hand, looked like a sort of allegorical personage, except that she had a considerable advantage over the general run of such personages in point of significant emblematical purpose. Flora had spread her bonnet and shawl upon the bed, with a care indicative of an intention to stay some time. Mr. Casby, too, was beaming near the hob, with his benevolent knob shining as if the warm butter of the toast were exuding through the patriarchal skull, and with his face as ruddy as if the colouring matter of the anchovy paste were mantling in the patriarchal visage. Seeing this, as he exchanged the usual salutations, Clennam decided to speak to his mother without postponement. It had long been customary, as she never changed her room, for those who had anything to say to her apart to wheel her to her desk, where she sat, usually with the back of her chair turned towards the rest of the room, and the person who talked with her seated in a corner on a stool which was always set in that place for that purpose. except that it was long since the mother and son had spoken together without the intervention of a third person. It was an ordinary matter, of course, within the experience of visitors, for Mrs. Clennam to be asked, with a word of apology for the interruption, if she could be spoken with on a matter of business, and, on her replying in the affirmative, to be wheeled into the position described. Therefore, when Arthur now made such an apology and such a request, and moved her to her desk and seated himself on the stool, Mrs. Finching merely began to talk louder and faster, as a delicate hint that she could overhear nothing, and Mr. Casby stroked his long white locks with sleepy calmness. "Mother, I have heard something today which I feel persuaded you don't know, and which I think you should know, of the antecedents of that man I saw here." "I know nothing of the antecedents of the man you saw here, Arthur." She spoke aloud. He had lowered his own voice, but she rejected that advance towards confidence, as she rejected every other, and spoke in her usual key and in her usual stern voice. "I have received it on no circuitous information. It has come to me direct." She asked him, exactly as before, if he were there to tell her what it was. "I thought it right that you should know it." "And what is it?" "He has been a prisoner in a French jail." She answered with composure, "I should think that very likely." "But in a jail for criminals, mother, on an accusation of murder." She started at the word, and her looks expressed her natural horror. Yet she still spoke aloud when she demanded, "Who told you so?" "A man who was his fellow prisoner." "That man's antecedents, I suppose, were not known to you before he told you?" "No." "Though the man himself was?" "Yes." "My case and Flintwinch's, in respect of this other man, I dare say the resemblance is not so exact, though, as that your informant became known to you through a letter from a correspondent with whom he had deposited money. How does that part of the parallel stand?" Arthur had no choice but to say that his informant had not become known to him through the agency of any such credentials, or indeed of any credentials at all. Mrs. Clennam's attentive frown expanded by degrees into a severe look of triumph, and she retorted with emphasis, "Take care how you judge others, then. I say to you, Arthur, for your good, take care how you judge." Her emphasis had been derived from her eyes quite as much as from the stress she laid upon her words. She continued to look at him, and if, when he entered the house, he had had any latent hope of prevailing in the least with her, she now looked it out of his heart. "Mother, shall I do nothing to assist you?" "Nothing." "Will you entrust me with no confidence, no charge, no explanation? Will you take no counsel with me? Will you not let me come near you?" "How can you ask me? You separated yourself from my affairs. It was not my act, it was yours. How can you consistently ask me such a question? You know that you left me to Flintwinch, and that he occupies your place." Glancing at Jeremiah, Clennam saw in his very gaiters that his attention was closely directed to them, though he stood leaning against the wall, scraping his jaw, and pretended to listen to Flora as she held forth in a most distracting manner on a chaos of subjects, in which Mackerel, Mr. F.'s aunt in a swing, had become entangled with cockchafers and the wine trade. "A prisoner in a French jail on an accusation of murder," repeated Mrs. Clennam, steadily going over what her son had said. "That is all you know of him from the fellow prisoner?" "In substance, all." "And was the fellow prisoner his accomplice and a murderer too? But of course he gives a better account of himself than of his friend. It is needless to ask. This will supply the rest of them here with something new to talk about. Casby, Arthur tells me—" "Stay, mother, stay," he interrupted her hastily, for it had not entered his imagination that she would openly proclaim what he had told her. "What now?" she said with displeasure. "What more?" I beg you to excuse me, Mr. Casby, and you too, Mrs. Finching, for one other moment with my mother." He had laid his hand upon a chair, or she would otherwise have wheeled it around with the touch of her foot upon the ground. They were still face to face. She looked at him as he ran over the possibilities of some result he had not intended and could not foresee, being influenced by Cavaletto's disclosure becoming a matter of notoriety, and hurriedly arrived at the conclusion that it had best not be talked about, though perhaps he was guided by no more distinct reason than that he had taken it for granted that his mother would reserve it to herself and her partner. "What now?" she said again impatiently. "What is it?" "I did not mean, mother, that you should repeat what I have communicated. I think you had better not repeat it." "Do you make that a condition with me?" "Well, yes." "Observe, then. It is you who make this a secret," said she, holding up her hand, "and not I. It is you, Arthur, who bring here doubts and suspicions and entreaties for explanations, and it is you, Arthur, who bring secrets here. What is it to me, do you think, where the man has been, or what he has been? What can it be to me? The whole world may know it if they care to know it. It is nothing to me. Now, let me go." He yielded to her imperious but elated look, and turned her chair back to the place from which he had wheeled it. In doing so he saw elation in the face of Mr. Flintwinch, which most assuredly was not inspired by Flora. This turning of his intelligence, and of his whole attempt and design against himself, did even more than his mother's fixedness and firmness to convince him that his efforts with her were idle. Nothing remained but the appeal to his old friend Affery. But even to get the very doubtful and preliminary stage of making the appeal seemed one of the least promising of human undertakings. She was so completely under the thrall of the two clever ones, was so systematically kept in sight by one or other of them, and was so afraid to go about the house besides, that every opportunity of speaking to her alone appeared to be forestalled. Over and above that, Mistress Affery, by some means, it was not very difficult to guess, through the sharp arguments of her liege lord, had acquired such a lively conviction of the hazard of saying anything under any circumstances, that she had remained all this time in a corner guarding herself from approach with that symbolical instrument of hers, so that when a word or two had been addressed to her by Flora, or even by the bottle-green patriarch himself, she had warded off conversation with a toasting fork, like a dumb woman. After several abortive attempts to get Affery to look at him while she cleared the table and washed the tea service, Arthur thought of an expedient which Flora might originate, to whom he therefore whispered, "Could you say you would like to go through the house?" Now poor Flora, being always in fluctuating expectation of the time when Clennam would renew his boyhood and be madly in love with her again, received the whisper with the utmost delight, not only as rendered precious by its mysterious character, but as preparing the way for a tender interview, in which he would declare the state of his affections. She immediately began to work out the hint. "Ah, dear me, the poor old room," said Flora, glancing round, "looks just as ever, Mrs. Clennam. I am touched to see, except for being smokier, which was to be expected with time, and which we must all expect and reconcile ourselves to being whether we like it or not, as I am sure I have not had to do myself, if not exactly smokier, dreadfully stouter, which is the same or worse. To think of the days when Papa used to bring me here, the least of girls, a perfect mass of chilblains, to be stuck upon a chair with my feet on the rails and stared at Arthur. Pray excuse me, Mr. Clennam, the least of boys in the frightfulest of frills and jackets here, yet Mr. F. appeared a misty shadow on the horizon, paying attentions like the well-known spectre of some place in Germany, beginning with a B, is a moral lesson inculcating that all the paths in life are similar to the paths down in the north of England, where they get the coals and make the iron and things gravelled with ashes." Having paid the tribute of a sigh to the instability of human existence, Flora hurried on with her purpose. "Not that at any time," she proceeded, "its worst enemy could have said it was a cheerful house, for that it was never made to be, but always highly impressive. Fond memory recalls an occasion in youth, ere yet the judgment was mature, when Arthur, confirmed habit, Mr. Clennam, took me down into an unused kitchen eminent for mouldiness, and proposed to secrete me there for life, and feed me on what he could hide from his meals, when he was not at home for the holidays, and on dry bread in disgrace, which at that halcyon period too frequently occurred. Would it be inconvenient or asking too much to beg to be permitted to revive those scenes and walk through the house? Mrs. Clennam, who responded with a constrained grace to Mrs. Finching's good nature in being there at all, though her visit before Arthur's unexpected arrival was undoubtedly an act of pure good nature and no self-gratification, intimated that all the house was open to her. Flora rose and looked to Arthur for his escort. "Certainly," said he aloud, "and Afy will light us, I dare say." Afy was excusing herself with, "Don't ask nothing of me, Arthur," when Mr. Flintwinch stopped her with, "Why not? Afy, what's the matter with you, woman? Why not, Jade?" Thus expostulated with, she came unwillingly out of her corner, resigned the toasting fork into one of her husband's hands, and took the candlestick he offered from the other. "Go before, you fool," said Jeremiah. "Are you going up or down, Mrs. Flinching?" Flora answered, "Down." "Then go before and down, you Afy," said Jeremiah, "and do it properly, or I'll come rolling down the banisters and tumbling over you." Afy headed the exploring party. Jeremiah closed it. He had no intention of leaving them. Clennam, looking back and seeing him following 3 stairs behind, in the coolest and most methodical manner, exclaimed in a low voice, "Is there no getting rid of him?" Flora reassured his mind by replying promptly, "Why, though not exactly proper, Arthur, and such a thing I couldn't think of before, a younger man or a stranger still, I don't mind him if you so particularly wish it, and provided you'll have the goodness not to take me too tight." Wanting the heart to explain that this was not at all what he meant, Arthur extended his supporting arm round Flora's figure. "Oh, my goodness me," said she. "You are very obedient indeed, really, and it's extremely honourable and gentlemanly in you, I am sure, but still, at the same time, if you would like to be a little tighter than that, I shouldn't consider it intruding." In this preposterous attitude, unspeakably at variance with his anxious mind, Clennam descended to the basement of the house, finding that wherever it became darker than elsewhere, Flora became heavier, and that when the house was lightest she was too. Returning from the dismal kitchen regions, which were as dreary as they could be, Mistress Afy passed with the light into his father's old room, and then into the old dining-room, always passing on before like a phantom that was not to be overtaken, and neither turning nor answering when he whispered, "Afy, I want to speak to you." In the dining-room, a sentimental desire came over Flora to look into the dragon closet which had so often swallowed Arthur in the days of his boyhood, not improbably because, as a very dark closet, it was a likely place to be heavy in. Arthur, fast subsiding into despair, had opened it when a knock was heard at the outer door. Mistress Afy, with a suppressed cry, threw her apron over her head. "What? You want another dose?" said Mr. Flintwinch. "You shall have it, my woman, you shall have a good one. Oh, you shall have a sneezer, you shall have a teaser." "In the meantime, is anybody going to the door?" said Arthur. "In the meantime, I'm going to the door, sir," returned the old man so savagely as to render it clear that in a choice of difficulties he felt he must go, though he would have preferred not to go. "Stay here the while all. Afy, my woman, move an inch or speak a word in your foolishness, and I'll treble your dose." The moment he was gone, Arthur released Mrs. Finching with some difficulty, by reason of that lady misunderstanding his intentions, and making arrangements with a view to tightening instead of slackening. "Afy, speak to me now." "Don't touch me, Arthur," she cried, shrinking from him. "Don't come near me. He'll see you, Jeremiah will. Don't." "He can't see me," returned Arthur, suiting the action to the word, "if I blow the candle out." "He'll hear you," cried Afy. "He can't hear me," returned Arthur, suiting the action to the words again, "if I draw you into this black closet and speak here." "Why do you hide your face?" "Because I'm afraid of seeing something." You can't be afraid of seeing anything in this darkness, Affery. Yes, I am, much more than if it was light. Why are you afraid? Because the house is full of mysteries and secrets, because it's full of whisperings and counsellings, because it's full of noises. There never was such a house for noises. I shall die of 'em if Jeremiah don't strangle me first, as I expect he will. I have never heard any noises here worth speaking of. Ah, but you would, though, if you lived in the house and was obliged to go about it as I am, said Affery, and you'd feel that they was so well worth speaking of that you'd feel you was nigh bursting through not being allowed to speak of 'em. Here's Jeremiah, you'll get me killed. My good Affery, I solemnly declare to you that I can see the light of the open door on the pavement of the hall, and so could you if you would uncover your face and look. I dursn't do it, said Affery. I dursn't never, Arthur. I'm always blindfolded when Jeremiah aren't a-looking, and sometimes even when he is. He cannot shut the door without my seeing him, said Arthur. You are as safe with me as if he was 50 miles away. I wish he was, cried Affery. Affery, I want to know what is amiss here. I want some light thrown on the secrets of this house. I tell you, Arthur, she interrupted, noises is the secrets, rustlings and stealings about, tremblings, treads overhead and treads underneath. But those are not all the secrets. I dunno, said Affery. Don't ask me no more. Your old sweetheart aren't far off, and she's a blabber. His old sweetheart being in fact so near at hand that she was then reclining against him in a flutter, a very substantial angle of 45 degrees, here interposed to assure Mistress Affery with greater earnestness than with directness of asseveration that what she heard should go no further, but should be kept inviolate, if on no other account on Arthur's sensible of intruding in being too familiar, Doyce and Clennam's. I make an imploring appeal to you, Affery, to you, one of the few agreeable early remembrances I have, for my mother's sake, for your husband's sake, for your own, for all our sakes. I am sure you can tell me something connected with the coming here of this man, if you will. Why, then I'll tell you, Arthur, returned Affery. Jeremiah's coming. No, indeed he is not. The door is open and he is standing outside talking. I tell you then, said Affery, after listening, that the first time he ever come he heard the noises his own self. What's that? He said to me. I don't know what it is, I says to him, catching hold of him, but I have heard it over and over again. While I says it, he stands a-looking at me all of a shake, he do. Has he been here often? Only that night and the last night. What did you see of him on the last night after I was gone? Them two clever ones had him all alone to themselves. Jeremiah come a-dancing at me sideways after I let you out. He always comes a-dancing at me sideways when he's going to hurt me. And he said to me, Now, Affery, he said, I'm a-coming behind you, my woman, and I'm going to run you up. So he took and squeezed the back of my neck in his hand till it made me open my mouth, and then he pushed me before him to bed, squeezing all the way. That's what he calls running me up, he do. Oh, he's a wicked one. And did you hear or see no more, Affery? Don't I tell you I was sent to bed, Arthur? Here he is. I assure you he is still at the door. Those whisperings and counsellings, Affery, that you have spoken of, what are they? How should I know? Don't ask me nothing about 'em, Arthur. Get away. But, my dear Affery, unless I can gain some insight into these hidden things, in spite of your husband and in spite of my mother, ruin will come of it. Don't ask me nothing, repeated Affery. I have been in a dream for ever so long. Go away, go away. You said that before, returned Arthur. You used the same expression that night at the door when I asked you what was going on here. What do you mean by being in a dream? I ain't going to tell you. Get away, I shouldn't tell you. If you was by yourself, much less with your old sweetheart here. It was equally vain for Arthur to entreat, and for Flora to protest. Affery, who had been trembling and struggling the whole time, turned a deaf ear to all adjuration, and was bent on forcing herself out of the closet. I'd sooner scream to Jeremiah than say another word. I'll call out to him, Arthur, if you don't give over speaking to me. Now, here's the very last word I'll say before I call him. If ever you begin to get the better of them two clever ones, your own self, you ought to it, as I told you when you first come home, for you haven't been a living here long years to be made afeard of your life as I have, Then do you get the better of 'em afore my face, and then do as you say to me. Affery, tell your dreams. Maybe then I'll tell 'em." The shutting of the door stopped Arthur from replying. They glided into the places where Jeremiah had left them, and Clennam, stepping forward as that old gentleman returned, informed him that he had accidentally extinguished the candle. Mr. Flintwinch looked on as he relighted it at the lamp in the hall, and preserved a profound taciturnity respecting the person who had been holding him in conversation. Perhaps his irascibility demanded compensation for some tediousness that the visitor had expended on him. However that was, he took such umbrage at seeing his wife with her apron over her head that he charged at her, and taking her veiled nose between his thumb and finger, appeared to throw the whole screw power of his person into the ring he gave it. Flora, now permanently heavy, did not release Arthur from the survey of the house until it had extended even to his old garret bedchamber. His thoughts were otherwise occupied than with the tour of inspection, yet he took particular notice at the time, as he afterwards had occasion to remember, of the airlessness and closeness of the house, that they left the track of their footsteps in the dust on the upper floors, and that there was a resistance to the opening of one room, which occasioned Affery to cry out that somebody was hiding inside, and to continue to believe so, though somebody was sought and not discovered. When they at last returned to his mother's room, they found her shading her face with her muffled hand, and talking in a low voice to the patriarch as he stood before the fire, whose blue eyes, polished head, and silken locks, turning towards them as they came in, imparted an inestimable value and inexhaustible love of his species to his remark. "So you have been seeing the premises, seeing the premises. It was not in itself a duel of benevolence or wisdom, yet he made it an exemplar of both that one would have liked to have a copy of." Chapter 24. The evening of a long day. That illustrious man and great national ornament, Mr. Merdle, continued his shining course. It began to be widely understood that one who had done society the admirable service of making so much money out of it could not be suffered to remain a commoner. A baronetcy was spoken of with confidence, a peerage was frequently mentioned. Rumour had it that Mr. Merdle had set his golden face against a baronetcy, that he had plainly intimated to Lord Decimus that a baronetcy was not enough for him, that he had said, "No, a peerage or plain Merdle." This was reported to have plunged Lord Decimus as nigh to his noble chin in a slough of doubts as to so lofty a person could be sunk. For the Barnacles, as a group of themselves in creation, had an idea that such distinctions belonged to them, and that when a soldier, sailor, or lawyer became ennobled, they let him in, as it were, by an act of condescension, at the family door, and immediately shut it again. Not only, said rumour, had the troubled Decimus his own hereditary part in this impression, but he also knew of several Barnacle claims already on the file, which came into collision with that of the master spirit. Right or wrong, rumour was very busy, and Lord Decimus, while he was, or was supposed to be, in stately excogitation of the difficulty, lent her some countenance by taking, on several public occasions, one of those elephantine trots of his through a jungle of overgrown sentences, waving Mr. Merdle about on his trunk as gigantic enterprise, the wealth of England, elasticity, credit, capital, prosperity, and all manner of blessings. So quietly did the mowing of the old scythe go on, that fully 3 months had passed unnoticed since the 2 English brothers had been laid in one tomb in the strangers' cemetery at Rome. Mr. and Mrs. Sparkler were established in their own house, a little mansion rather of the tight barnacle class, quite a triumph of inconvenience, with a perpetual smell in it of the day before yesterday's soup and coach-horses, but extremely dear as being exactly in the centre of the habitable globe. In this enviable abode, and envied it really was by many people, Mrs. Sparkler had intended to proceed at once to the demolition of the bosom, when active hostilities had been suspended by the arrival of the courier with his tidings of death. Mrs. Sparkler, who was not unfeeling, had received them with a violent burst of grief which had lasted 12 hours, after which she had arisen to see about her mourning, and to take every precaution that could ensure its being as becoming as Mrs. Merdle's. A gloom was then cast over more than one distinguished family, according to the politest sources of intelligence, and the courier went back again. Mr. and Mrs. Sparkler had been dining alone, with their gloom cast over them, and Mrs. Sparkler reclined on a drawing-room sofa. It was a hot summer Sunday evening. The residence in the centre of the habitable globe, at all times stuffed and close, as if it had an incurable cold in its head, was that evening particularly stifling. The bells of the churches had done their worst in the way of clanging among the unmelodious echoes of the streets, and the lighted windows of the churches had ceased to be yellow in the grey dusk, and had died out opaque black. Mrs. Sparkler, lying on her sofa, looking through an open window at the opposite side of a narrow street over boxes of mignonette and flowers, was tired of the view. Mrs. Sparkler, looking at another window where her husband stood in the balcony, was tired of that view. Mrs. Sparkler, looking at herself in her mourning, was even tired of that view, though naturally not so tired of that as of the other two. "It's like lying in a well," said Mrs. Sparkler, changing her position fretfully. "Dear me, Edmund, if you have anything to say, why don't you say it?" Mr. Sparkler might have replied with ingenuousness, "My life, I have nothing to say." But, as the repartee did not occur to him, he contented himself with coming in from the balcony and standing at the side of his wife's couch. "Good gracious, Edmund," said Mrs. Sparkler more fretfully still, "you are absolutely putting mignonette up your nose. Pray don't." Mr. Sparkler, in absence of mind, perhaps in a more literal absence of mind than is usually understood by the phrase, had smelt so hard at a sprig in his hand as to be on the verge of the offence in question. He smiled, said, "I ask your pardon, my dear," and threw it out of window. "You make my head ache by remaining in that position, Edmund," said Mrs. Sparkler, raising her eyes to him after another minute. "You look so aggravatingly large by this light. Do sit down." "Certainly, my dear," said Mr. Sparkler, and took a chair on the same spot. "If I didn't know that the longest day was past," said Fanny, yawning in a dreary manner, "I should have felt certain this was the longest day. I never did experience such a day." "Is that your fan, my love?" asked Mr. Sparkler, picking up one and presenting it. "Edmund," returned his wife more wearily yet, "don't ask weak questions. I entreat you not. Whose can it be but mine?" "Yes, I thought it was yours," said Mr. Sparkler. "Then you shouldn't ask," retorted Fanny. After a little while, she turned on her sofa and exclaimed, dear me, there never was such a long day as this." After another little while, she got up slowly, walked about, and came back again. "My dear," said Mr. Sparkler, flashing with an original conception, "I think you must have got the fidgets." "Oh, fidgets," repeated Mrs. Sparkler, "don't." "My adorable girl," urged Mr. Sparkler, "try your aromatic vinegar. I have often seen my mother try it, and it seemingly refreshed her. And as she is, as I believe you are aware, a remarkably fine woman with no Good gracious!" exclaimed Fanny, starting up again. "It's beyond all patience. This is the most wearisome day that ever did dawn upon the world, I am certain." Mr. Sparkler looked meekly after her as she lounged about the room, and he appeared to be a little frightened. When she had tossed a few trifles about, and had looked down into the darkening street out of all the 3 windows, she returned to her sofa and threw herself among its pillows. "Now, Edmund, come here. Come a little nearer, because I want to be able to touch you with my fan, that I may impress you very much with what I am going to say. That will do. Quite close enough. Oh, you do look so big." Mr. Sparkler apologized for the circumstance, pleaded that he couldn't help it, and said that our fellows, without more particularly indicating whose fellows, used to call him by the name of Quinbus Flestrin Jr., or the Young Man Mountain. "You ought to have told me so before," Fanny complained. "My dear," returned Mr. Sparkler, rather gratified, "I didn't know it would interest you, or I would have made a point of telling you." "There, for goodness sake, don't talk," said Fanny. "I want to talk myself. Edmund, we must not be alone any more. I must take such precautions as will prevent my being ever again reduced to the state of dreadful depression in which I am this evening." "My dear," answered Mr. Sparkler, "being as you are well known to be a remarkably fine woman with no. "Oh, good gracious!" cried Fanny. Mr. Sparkler was so discomposed by the energy of this exclamation, accompanied with a flouncing up from the sofa and a flouncing down again, that a minute or two elapsed before he felt himself equal to saying in explanation, "I mean, my dear, that everybody knows you are calculated to shine in society." "Calculated to shine in society?" retorted Fanny with great irritability. "Yes, indeed. And then what happens? I no sooner recover, in a visiting point of view, the shock of poor dear papa's death and my poor uncle's, though I do not disguise from myself that the last was a happy release, for, if you are not presentable, you had much better die." "You are not referring to me, my love, I hope?" Mr. Sparkler humbly interrupted. Edmund, you would wear out a saint. Am I not expressly speaking of my poor uncle?" "You looked with so much expression at myself, my dear girl," said Mr. Sparkler, "that I felt a little uncomfortable. Thank you, my love." "Now, you have put me out," observed Fanny, with a resigned toss of her fan, "and I had better go to bed." "Don't do that, my love," urged Mr. Sparkler. "Take time." Fanny took a good deal of time. Lying back with her eyes shut and her eyebrows raised with a hopeless expression, as if she had utterly given up all terrestrial affairs. At length, without the slightest notice, she opened her eyes again, and recommended in a short, sharp manner, "What happens then, I ask? What happens? Why, I find myself at the very period when I might shine most in society, and should most like, for very momentous reasons, to shine in society, I find myself in a situation which, to a certain extent, disqualifies me for going into society. It's too bad, really." "My dear," said Mr. Sparkler, "I don't think it need keep you at home." "Edmund, you ridiculous creature," returned Fanny with a great indignation. "Do you suppose that a woman in the bloom of youth, and not wholly devoid of personal attractions, can put herself at such a time in competition as to figure with a woman in every other way her inferior? If you do suppose such a thing, your folly is boundless." Mr. Sparkler submitted that he had thought it might be got over. "Got over?" repeated Fanny, with immeasurable scorn. "For a time," Mr. Sparkler submitted. Honouring the last feeble suggestion with no notice, Mrs. Sparkler declared with bitterness that it really was too bad, and that positively it was enough to make one wish one was dead. "However," she said, when she had in some measure recovered from her sense of personal ill-usage, "provoking as it is, and cruel as it seems, I suppose it must be submitted to." "Especially as it was to be expected," said Mr. Sparkler. "Edmund," returned his wife, "if you have nothing more becoming to do than to attempt to insult the woman who has honoured you with her hand when she finds herself in adversity, I think you had better go to bed." Mr. Sparkler was much afflicted by the charge, and offered a most tender and earnest apology. His apology was accepted, but Mrs. Sparkler requested him to go round to the other side of the sofa, and to sit in the window curtain to tone himself down. "Now, Edmund," she said, stretching out her fan and touching him with it at arm's length, "what I was going to say to you when you began as usual to prose and worry is that I shall guard against our being alone any more, and that when circumstances prevent my going out to my own satisfaction, I must arrange to have some people or other always here, for I really cannot and will not have another such day as this has been." Mr. Sparkler's sentiments as to the plan were, in brief, that it had no nonsense about it. He added, "And besides, you know it's likely that you'll soon have your sister." "Dearest Amy, yes!" cried Mrs. Sparkler with a sigh of affection. "Darling little thing! Not, however, that Amy would do here alone." Mr. Sparkler was going to say, "No?" interrogatively, but he saw his danger and said it assentingly. "No, oh dear no, she wouldn't do here alone." "No, Edmund, for not only are the virtues of the precious child of that still character that they require a contrast, require life and movement around them to bring out in their right colours and make one love them of all things, but she will require to be roused on more accounts than one." "That's it," said Mr. Sparkler. "Roused." "Pray don't, Edmund. Your habit of interrupting without having the least thing in the world to say distracts one. You must be broken of it. Speaking of Amy, my poor little pet was devotedly attached to poor papa, and no doubt will have lamented his loss exceedingly, and grieved very much. I have done so myself. I have felt it dreadfully, but Amy will no doubt have felt it even more from having been on the spot the whole time, and having been with poor dear papa at the last, which I unhappily was not." Here Fanny stopped to weep and to say, "Dear, dear, beloved papa, how truly gentlemanly he was! What a contrast to poor uncle!" "From the effects of that trying time," she pursued, "my good little mouse will have to be roused. Also, from the effects of this long attendance upon Edward in his illness, an attendance which is not yet over, which may even go on for some time longer, and which in the meanwhile unsettles us all by keeping poor dear papa's affairs from being wound up. Fortunately, however, the papers with his agents here being all sealed up and locked up as he left them when he providentially came to England, the affairs are in that state of order that they can wait until my brother Edward recovers his health in Sicily, sufficiently to come over and administer or execute or whatever it may be that will have to be done." "He couldn't have a better nurse to bring him round," Mr. Sparkler made bold to opine. "For a wonder I can agree with you," returned his wife, languidly, turning her eyelids a little in his direction. She held forth, in general, as if to the drawing-room furniture, "and can adopt your words. He couldn't have a better nurse to bring him round. There are times when my dear child is a little wearing to an active mind, but, as a nurse, she is perfection. Best of Amy's." Mr. Sparkler, growing rash on his late success, observed that Edward had had, by God, a long bout of it, my dear girl. "If bout, Edmund," returned Mrs. Sparkler, "is the slang term for indisposition, he has. If it is not, I am unable to give an opinion on the barbarous language you addressed to Edward's sister. That he contracted malaria fever somewhere, either by travelling day and night to Rome, where, after all, he arrived too late to see poor dear papa before his death, or under some other unwholesome circumstances, is indubitable, if that is what you mean. Likewise, that his extremely careless life has made him a very bad subject for it indeed." Mr. Sparkler considered it a parallel case to that of some of our fellows in the West Indies with Yellow Jack. Mrs. Sparkler closed her eyes again and refused to have any consciousness of our fellows of the West Indies or of Yellow Jack. "So Amy," she pursued, when she reopened her eyelids, "will require to be roused from the effects of many tedious and anxious weeks. And lastly, she will require to be roused from a low tendency which I know very well to be at the bottom of her heart. Don't ask me what it is, Edmund, because I must decline to tell you." "I'm not going to, my dear," said Mr. Sparkler. "I shall thus have much improvement to effect in my sweet child," Mrs. Sparkler continued, "and cannot have her near me too soon. Amiable and dear little Two-Shoes. As to the settlement of poor papa's affairs, my interest in that is not very selfish. Papa behaved very generously to me when I was married, and I have little or nothing to expect. Provided he had made no will that can come into force leaving a legacy to Mrs. General, I am contented. Dear papa, dear papa. She wept again, but Mrs. General was the best of restoratives. The name soon stimulated her to dry her eyes and say, "It is a highly encouraging circumstance in Edward's illness, I am thankful to think, and gives one the greatest confidence in his sense of not being impaired or his proper spirit weakened, down to the time of poor dear papa's death at all events, that he paid off Mrs. General instantly and sent her out of the house. I applaud him for it. I could forgive him a great deal for doing with such promptitude so exactly what I would have done myself." Mrs. Sparkler was in full glow of her gratification when a double knock was heard at the door. A very odd knock. Low, as if to avoid making a noise and attracting attention. Long, as if the person knocking were preoccupied in mind and forgot to leave off. "Hello," said Mr. Sparkler. "Who's this?" "Not Amy and Edward without notice and without a carriage," said Mrs. Sparkler. "Look out." The room was dark, but the street was lighter, because of its lamps. Mr. Sparkler's head, peeping over the balcony, looked so very bulky and heavy that it seemed on the point of overbalancing him and flattening the unknown below. "It's one fellow," said Mr. Sparkler. "I can't see who. Stop, though." On this second thought, he went out into the balcony again and had another look. He came back as the door was opened and announced that he believed he had identified his governor's tile. He was not mistaken, for his governor, with his tile in his hand, was introduced immediately afterwards. "Candles," said Mrs. Sparkler, with a word of excuse for the darkness. "It's light enough for me," said Mr. Merdle. When the candles were brought in, Mr. Merdle was discovered standing behind the door picking his lips. "I thought I'd give you a call," he said. "I'm rather particularly occupied just now, and as I happen to be out for a stroll, I thought I'd give you a call." As he was in dinner dress, Fanny asked him where he had been dining. "Well," said Mr. Merdle, "I haven't been dining anywhere particularly." "Of course you have dined," said Fanny. "Why, no, I haven't exactly dined," said Mr. Merdle. He had pressed his hand over his yellow forehead and considered as if he were not sure about it. Something to eat was proposed. "No, thank you," said Mr. Merdle. "I don't feel inclined for it. I was to have dined out along with Mrs. Merdle, but as I didn't feel inclined for dinner, I let Mrs. Merdle go by herself just as we were getting into the carriage and thought I'd take a stroll instead." "Would he have tea or coffee?" "No, thank you," said Mr. Merdle. "I looked in at the club and got a bottle of wine." At this point of his visit, Mr. Merdle took the chair which Edmund Sparkler had offered him, and which he had hitherto been pushing slowly about before him, like a dull man with a pair of skates on for the first time, who could not make up his mind to start. He now put his hat upon another chair beside him, and, looking down into it as if it were some 20 feet deep, said again, "You see, I thought I'd give you a call." "Flattering to us," said Fanny, "for you are not a calling man." "No, no," returned Mr. Merdle, who was by this time taking himself into custody under both coat sleeves. "No, I am not a calling man." "You have too much to do for that," said Fanny. "Having so much to do, Mr. Merdle, loss of appetite is a serious thing with you, and you must have seen it too. You must not be ill." "Oh, I am very well," replied Mr. Merdle, after deliberating about it. "I am as well as I usually am. I am well enough. I am as well as I want to be." The master mind of the age, true to its characteristic of being at all times a mind that had as little as possible to say for itself, and great difficulty in saying it, became mute again. Mrs. Sparkler began to wonder how long the master mind meant to stay. "I was speaking of poor papa when you came in, sir." "Aye, quite a coincidence," said Mr. Merdle. Fanny did not see that, but felt it incumbent on her to continue talking. "I was saying," she pursued, "that my brother's illness has occasioned a delay in examining and arranging papa's property." "Yes," said Mr. Merdle, "yes, there has been a delay." "Not that it is of consequence," said Fanny. "Not assented Mr. Merdle, after having examined the cornice of all that part of the room which was within his range. "Not that it is of any consequence." "My only anxiety is," said Fanny, "that Mrs. General should not get anything." "She won't get anything," said Mr. Merdle. Fanny was delighted to hear him express the opinion. Mr. Merdle, after taking another gaze into the depths of his hat, as if he thought he saw something at the bottom, rubbed his hair and slowly appended it to his last remark, the confirmatory words, "Oh dear, no. No, not she. Not likely." As the topic seemed exhausted, and Mr. Merdle too, Fanny inquired if we were going to take up Mrs. Merdle in the carriage in his way home. "No," he answered. "I shall go by the shortest way, and leave Mrs. Merdle to—" Here he looked all over the palms of both his hands, as if he were telling his own fortune. "To take care of herself. I dare say she'll manage to do it." "Probably," said Fanny. There was then a long silence, during which Mrs. Sparkler, lying back on her sofa again, shut her eyes and raised her eyebrows in her former retirement from mundane affairs. "But, however," said Mr. Merdle, "I am equally detaining you and myself. I thought I'd give you a call, you know." "Charmed, I'm sure," said Fanny. "So I'm off," added Mr. Merdle, getting up. "Could you lend me a penknife?" It was an odd thing, Fanny smilingly observed, for her, who could seldom prevail upon herself even to write a letter, to lend to a man of such vast business as Mr. Merdle. "Isn't it?" Mr. Merdle acquiesced. "But I want one, and I know you have got several little wedding keepsakes about, with scissors and tweezers and such things in them. You shall have it back tomorrow." "Edmund," said Mrs. Sparkler, "open, now very carefully, I beg and beseech you, for you are so very awkward, the mother-of-pearl box on my little table there, and give Mr. Merdle the mother-of-pearl penknife." "Thank you," said Mr. Merdle. "But if you have got another one with a darker handle, I think I should prefer one with a darker handle." "Tortoise-shell?" "Thank you," said Mr. Merdle. "Yes, I think I should prefer tortoise-shell." Edmund accordingly received instructions to open the tortoise-shell box and give Mr. Merdle the tortoise-shell knife. On his doing so, his wife said to the master spirit graciously, "I will forgive you if you ink it." "I'll undertake not to ink it," said Mr. Merdle. The illustrious visitor then put out his coat cuff, and for a moment entombed Mrs. Sparkler's hand, wrist, bracelet, and all. Where his own hand had shrunk to was not made manifest, but it was as remote from Mrs. Sparkler's sense of touch as if he had been a highly meritorious Chelsea veteran or Greenwich pensioner. Thoroughly convinced, as he went out of the room, that it was the longest day that ever did come to an end at last, and that there never was a woman, not wholly devoid of personal attractions, so worn out by idiotic and lumpish people, Fanny passed into the balcony for a breath of air. Waters of vexation filled her eyes, and they had the effect of making the famous Mr. Merdle, in going down the street, appear to leap and waltz and gyrate, as if he were possessed of several devils. Chapter 25. The Chief Butler resigns the seals of office. The dinner party was at the great physician's. Barr was there, and in full force. Ferdinand Barnacle was there, and in his most engaging state. Few ways of life were hidden from physician, and he was oftener in its darkest places than even Bishop. There were brilliant ladies about London who perfectly doted on him, my dear, as the most charming creature and the most delightful person, who would have been shocked to find themselves so close to him if they could have known on what sights those thoughtful eyes of his head had rested within an hour or two, and near to whose beds and under what roofs his composed figure had stood. But Physician was a composed man, who performed neither on his own trumpet nor on the trumpets of other people. Many wonderful things did he see and hear, and much irreconcilable moral contradiction did he pass his life among, yet his equality of compassion was no more disturbed than the divine master's of all healing was. He went, like the rain, among the just and unjust, doing all the good he could, and neither proclaiming it in the synagogues nor at the corners of streets. As no man of large experience of humanity, however quietly carried it may be, can fail to be invested with an interest peculiar to the possession of such knowledge, Physician was an attractive man. Even the daintier gentlemen and ladies, who had no idea of his secret, and who would have been startled out of more wits than they had by the monstrous impropriety of his proposing to them, "Come and see what I see," confessed his attraction. Where he was, something real was, and half a grain of reality, like the smallest portion of some other scarce natural productions, will flavour an enormous quantity of diluent. It came to pass, therefore, that Physician's little dinners always presented people in their least conventional lights. The guests said to themselves, whether they were conscious of it or no, "Here is a man who really has an acquaintance with us as we are, who is admitted to some of us every day with our wigs and paint off, who hears the wanderings of our minds, and sees the undisguised expression of our faces when both are past our control. We may as well make an approach to reality with him, for the man has got the better of us and is too strong for us." Therefore, Physician's guests came out so surprisingly at his round table that they were almost natural. Barr's knowledge of that agglomeration of jurymen which is called humanity was as sharp as a razor, yet a razor is not a generally convenient instrument, and Physician's plain bright scalpel, though far less keen, was adaptable to far wider purposes. Barr knew all about the gullibility and knavery of people, but Physician could have given him a better insight into their tendernesses and affections in 1 week of his rounds than Westminster Hall and all the circuits put together in 60 years and 10. Barr always had a suspicion of this, and perhaps was glad to encourage it, for if the world were really a great law court, one would think that the last day of term could not too soon arrive, and so he liked and respected Physician quite as much as any other kind of man did. Mr. Merdle's default left a Banquo's chair at the table, but if he had been there, he would have merely made the difference of Banquo in it, and consequently he was no loss. Barr, who picked up all sorts of odds and ends about Westminster Hall, much as a raven would have done if he had passed as much of his time there, had been picking up a great many straws lately and tossing them about, to try which way the Merdle wind blew. He now had a little talk on the subject with Mrs. Merdle herself, sidling up to that lady, of course, with his double eyeglass and his jury droop. "A certain bird," said Barr, and he looked as if it could have been no other bird than a magpie, "has been whispering among us lawyers lately that there is to be an addition to the titled personages of this realm." "Really?" said Mrs. Merdle. "Yes," said Barr. "Has not the bird been whispering in very different ears from ours, in lovely ears?" He looked expressively at Mrs. Merdle's nearest earring. "Do you mean mine?" asked Mrs. Merdle. "When I say lovely," said Barr, "I always mean you." "You never mean anything, I think," returned Mrs. Merdle, not displeased. "Oh, cruelly unjust," said Barr. "But the bird—" "I am the last person in the world to hear news," observed Mrs. Merdle, carelessly arranging her stronghold. "Who is it?" "What an admirable witness you make," said Barr. "No jury, unless we could impanel one of blind men, could resist you, if you were ever so bad a one, but you would be such a good one." "Why, you ridiculous man?" asked Mrs. Merdle, laughing. Barr waved his double eyeglass 3 or 4 times between himself and the bosom as a rallying answer, and inquired in his most insinuating accents, "What am I to call the most elegant, accomplished, and charming of women, a few weeks, or may be it a few days hence?" "Didn't your bird tell you what to call her?" answered Mrs. Merdle. Do ask it tomorrow, and tell me the next time you see me what it says." This led to further passages of similar pleasantry between the two, but Bar, with all his sharpness, got nothing out of them. Physician, on the other hand, taking Mrs. Merdle down to her carriage and attending on her as she put on her cloak, inquired into the symptoms with his usual calm directness. "May I ask," he said, "is this true about Merdle?" "My dear doctor," she returned, "you ask me the very question that I was half disposed to ask you." "To ask me? Why me?" "Upon my honour, I think Mr. Merdle reposes greater confidence in you than in anyone." "On the contrary, he tells me absolutely nothing, even professionally. You have heard the talk, of course?" "Of course I have. But you know what Mr. Merdle is. You know how taciturn and reserved he is. I assure you I have no idea what foundation for it there may be. I should like it to be true. Why should I deny that to you? You would know better if I did." "Just so," said Physician. "But whether it is all true or partly true or entirely false, I am wholly unable to say. It is a most provoking situation, a most absurd situation, but you know Mr. Merdle, and are not surprised." Physician was not surprised, handed her into her carriage, and bade her good night.